All right, let's give it just a couple more minutes. Yeah, as new students come in. But for those of you who are here, let me resend the Replit link again. Honestly, you guys, if you guys have your own development environments, feel free to work there as well. Today is gonna be like a quick lecture, kind of just talking about how to put HTML, CSS, and JavaScript together, and then just some hands-on practice that you guys are gonna do. And then we'll end with a Kahoot as long as we have time. Let me get the Replit link in case you guys want to work there. Okay. And yeah, let's just wait a couple more minutes. Okay, great. I think we'll get started. For those of you who weren't here when I mentioned it earlier, today basically we're just going to go over HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, how to put them together, synthesize how they work together, and then maybe show you guys some other examples of different combinations of languages that use the same principles so that when you see other types of web development, it's familiar as well. Then we'll go on to some hands-on practice, and then finally we'll do a Kahoot. Okay, so let me share my screen real quick. Give me just 1 second. Why is it not letting me? Okay, got it now. Okay, great. So I'm back in the Replit. For today, as I mentioned before, let me resend the Replit link in case you guys weren't here when I did earlier. Okay, if you guys want to work in the Replit, feel free to. If you guys have your own IDEs, whatever you want to use, that's fine as well. I'm just going to use Replit to show you guys a couple of things that I want to highlight. I feel like we went over this a little bit when we talked about CSS and JavaScript respectively, but we didn't really synthesize it. So first of all, I've been teaching you guys that the HTML is like the homepage, right? Where everything lives. So you're going to connect the JavaScript into the HTML, the CSS into the HTML. But in addition to that, there's also components of JavaScript and CSS that take things from the HTML as well. So, but before we get to that, just really quickly to recap how we actually import JavaScript files and CSS files into the HTML. This line here, in line 13, this is how we import a CSS file into HTML. We start with a link. So remember, CSS is links, and here you'll see this attribute called rel. So these two things are attributes that you're going to want to memorize or at least be familiar with. So this is talking about like what it is. Like it's a style sheet, is just to let HTML know what it is. And then this is the really key part. So href, think of it like a reference, right? This is the file destination, style.css. And I touched on this a little bit last time, but make sure when you're doing these references that you know whether you're going to use a absolute file destination or a relative one. So by that, I mean, for example, this is relative. There are tons of style.css files. I would guarantee you that basically any website on the web, they're going to have a CSS file that's called style or styles. The reason that I'm able to simply say style.css and Replit knows what I'm talking about is because I'm in this environment. I'm in this Replit called Rosy Fluid Atom that Replit has created for me. And all of these things are located here. So when you're using a tool like this, when you're in the same directory, the same folder, the same general location, think of it that way. When you're in the same directory, when your HTML and your CSS is in the same directory, you can use these relative paths to specify what they are. And technically you can if they're in different directories as well, but generally that just makes it harder to read. However, Replit, while we're working in this environment that's on the web, one of the reasons that we use a relative path is because you simply don't know the absolute path. I don't know what folder, what directory all of this is located in on the Replit server. I don't have access to that. So I'm actually forced to use a relative path, which is a rare occurrence, but sometimes you will come across it. Otherwise, as a general principle, absolute file paths. So the complicated things that you see when you open a command terminal, like this if you're on Windows, or maybe like a single slash if you're on Mac or Linux, all of these things, those are absolute paths. There's only one of them ever on your hard drive, and there's no confusion whatsoever. So if you want the precision and the accuracy and make sure that you're not accidentally confusing something, then use an absolute file path. Okay, so just remember a link tag, a link element is for CSS, and you have to have a reference to the file destination of your CSS file. Okay, and then for JavaScript, okay, I actually haven't included one, but so script, if you add a script tag here, well, this is something else I should mention actually. So I know we talked about inline CSS, which is where you add CSS into the actual line here. For example, when I have the class, I can add styles to this. I can say color equals something else, and I could do inline CSS. You can't do inline JavaScript, but you can do JavaScript within the actual HTML as well. And you do that using the script elements. So within this script, you're going to use, within here, you're just typing JavaScript. So for example, let's say I have an element E dot on click, and then I'm going to do something, etc. This is just basic JavaScript that you can type in here. But this is generally frowned upon because there's really not any like temporary or like small modifications that you want to make when it comes to functionalities. Inline CSS is more to override, because we saw before, if you have nested elements and nested tags, there's going to be so much overriding that it's really hard to keep track. And so sometimes for one specific thing, it's not necessary to create yet another class or yet another CSS block just for it. And so maybe you want to use inline CSS in that case. But JavaScript generally frowned upon. And just so we're incorporating some of the resources that we've been talking about, remember, W3 Schools is a really, really good resource to use for all things web development. For example, you'll have the basic HTML, CSS, JavaScript, but you'll also have Python, Java, but other things related to web development. You're going to have SQL, which is about databases, PHP, which is about that as well. You're also going to have Bootstrap, Twitter Bootstrap, which is a more complex version of CSS. These are things that we'll touch on next week, but just know this is a really good resource. So let's see. Yes, I'll touch on that in just a second. But yeah, okay, this is what I want to show you. So see, it's a really comprehensive tutorial on how you're actually going to embed these things. Remember when I mentioned the script tags here? The way you embed JavaScript into HTML is the same whether you're using whether you're typing JavaScript or you're just importing a different file. And that's the main difference between JavaScript and CSS. With inline CSS, you're just straight up writing CSS without any tags, or elements. But when you're actually importing a file, you're going to have to use the link. Here, however, as you can see, we're always going to use the script tag. So if I go back to my replit here, this is the exact way I would actually import a external JavaScript file. And the only difference is I'm just not going to have any content between these two tags. Instead, I'm going to add a reference here, src, which stands for source, and I'm going to type again the file destination of my JavaScript file, which in this case is script.js, as you can see over here. If we renamed it something else, it would just be whatever we renamed it. So a couple of things here. So look, remember, CSS uses a link tag. JavaScript uses a script tag. And for the file destinations, CSS uses an href, a reference, which is the same for any links, even if you're doing like some random link on the web. However, you're going to have source or src for a JavaScript file. So just keep that in mind. Now, the other thing I want to talk about before we move on to the reverse process of this, putting HTML into JavaScript CSS, is that you have to make sure that you're being careful where you're putting these things. So if we go back to the tutorial, you guys might have seen this as I was scrolling through, there's a huge difference depending on whether you put JavaScript in the head or the body. Now, okay, this is kind of long. You can look through these tutorials if you want. But basically, to sum it up, they're a little different for CSS and JavaScript. So with CSS, you typically want to just put it in the head because CSS is static. You're not going to be changing the actual CSS with inline CSS and things as you're going through this process. You might change your CSS with the JavaScript, however, and I'll touch on that in a bit. But when you're first opening your HTML document, you just want to load all of your styles into there first. The script, however, that's something different. So typically you want to put metadata, like things that are not actual website content within the head. But this is one exception. Through a lot of trial and error, I can tell you that putting the script tag at the very end of your body is actually something good to do, because it's a little complex to explain, but in simple terms, it's basically when you put the JavaScript within the body tags, the HTML treats it as something that can change. So as we've mentioned before, I can remotely do things to my web page using JavaScript. So HTML inherently knows that these different tags, these different elements within the body are going to change, or they could change. And so if you put it here, the script not only comes after things that are going to change, it's signifying that it's a static thing as well. If you simply put it at the very top of the head, sometimes you're going to do a lot of modification within the JavaScript and a lot of modification with these things as the web page is loading, as the user is using the web page. And in that case, some of the things that you change aren't going to be loaded again because they're just static. They're in the head. They're already loaded. The computer thinks that they're done with the job. when you've updated it, and those updates are now not reflected. So in order to keep up to date with all the functional changes that you're making, I recommend putting your script tag at the bottom of your body tag, or at the top, honestly. There are very small differences between these things, and this article here is a really, really good one. So let me just put it in the chat in case you guys are interested. This is really good for talking about where you put the actual script tag. And it's a huge thing. There's no standard for it, honestly. A lot of people use different ones. Okay. So now that we've talked about putting JavaScript and CSS into the HTML, let's talk about the reverse. How do we access HTML in the JavaScript and CSS? So in CSS, it's relatively simple. We just use the selectors. If you remember, this is selecting the actual tags. A dot would be selecting the classes. A pound key or a hashtag would be selecting the actual IDs, all of which are attributes that we add into the HTML. This is the connection between the HTML and CSS. In JavaScript, however, this is a little bit different. So I didn't really go over the syntax of this in JavaScript, in our JavaScript lesson, but now's a good time to go over it. So document here. Document is, you can see it's in white, like any other variable. However, this is actually like a keyword in JavaScript. I don't know why Replit doesn't make it a different color, but document is your HTML. Now, we never have to specify, if you notice, in both the CSS and the JavaScript, we never specified the path, the file destination, the path of the index.html. That's because once we've specified the JavaScript and CSS in the HTML, it's like a two-way link already. Document is simply the variable that lets us access HTML within our JavaScript. So use the document keyword and then the dot. So dot, remember, we talked about last time, is kind of like an operator. It says to get some sort of attribute, get some sort of method from this variable. And in this case, document is a variable. It's just a really, really complex object that represents the HTML file. So we're still going to use the dot operator. And then this, as you can see highlighted in yellow, this is a method that's inherently built into HTML. So we never had to define our own functions like we talked about last time. So you're going to get an element by ID. This is the recommended way to do things, or like the most popular way, I guess. So getting it by the ID, first of all, requires that you have an ID set in the HTML. So if we go back to the HTML, for example, okay, I think let's change this. Let's call this my div, okay? And let's say that I want to select this div right here. So I'm going to add an ID. Remember, this is an ID attribute, is just part of HTML, and I'm going to call it my div. So now my script is not only connected to the HTML document. Once I take the HTML document, I can use the method to find the element with the ID, my div. And now this button element is a variable. This button variable points directly to that div element. And anything I do to that later on is going to be reflective of what is being done to that element in the web page. Okay, so once I do this, I've essentially separated the HTML from the JavaScript. I'm able to shorten it down to this variable that I can do various things to. And this is the really key part. You can have get element by other things as well. You can have it by class, or what else is there, honestly? You can get it by class, you can get it by tags, I think. But really getting it by the ID is typically what you do, because you're not going to apply the same functionalities to every part of the same class. That's more for organization, as we talked about in HTML. Now, the other thing is, as you can see here, this is another method that is not specific to the document, the HTML document, but actually to an HTML element. So these are things that, honestly, like, you really don't have to memorize. There are tons and tons and tons of methods based on what sort of HTML element you actually have. But this is one of the most basic ones: add an event listener. So an event is just whatever happens to the thing on the web page. And so basically what this anything within the brackets here now is gonna, in JavaScript, define a function that continuously listens or watches or notices what's going on in the web page itself. And it's constantly updating. So it's in real time. And it takes two things. So remember we talked about parameters last time. Parameters are what we pass into a function, what the function needs to do its work. The first piece of information that the add event listener method needs is this click. It can be different things as well, but click is one of the most basic ones. When I click on some element within the web page, normally I want it to do something, to have some sort of reaction. So this add event listener, this function needs to know what event it's listening for. So I tell the first parameter is going to be what it's listening for. And then I'm going to define a function. So I'm actually passing a function into the add event listener function. It's telling the add event listener function, hey, when you see a click, then execute whatever is in my function. This is a little bit of a like a complicated way to define it, but see, I'm actually defining a function within these brackets. This is the work I wanted to do. I'm defining it within the parameter parentheses itself. So sometimes it'll look really messy, but this is a common practice done by a lot of web developers. So just be aware that that's something there is. Okay, so I think we've covered how we access. Oh, one more thing, right? How do we've talked about HTML and JavaScript, HTML and CSS, but how do we access CSS from JavaScript? And notice there's no reverse to this. I'm never going to access my JavaScript from my CSS file because the CSS doesn't do anything. But sometimes I do want to change my styles. For example, when I click on a button or I load a new page, I want my web page to change some colors or to change its styles somehow. And the way I do that is actually not explicitly referencing the CSS file, but referencing the HTML elements. And then from that element, referencing its CSS attributes. So, for example, if we go back to W3 Schools, there was a really good article that I pulled up earlier. Where did I put that article? Okay, I don't remember where that article is, but basically what you're going to do is I'm going to take this and I'm going to change. Okay, I think it's good if you guys have a visual. Give me one sec. Let me go through my history and see if I can find the article. There was a good visual in it. No, okay, I got it. So this is the article I was talking about earlier. So the reason I think this is really good is because I think it's good to get practice thinking about like, this puts the JavaScript within the HTML itself as well. So basically what we're going to do is first, in the JavaScript, I'm going to get the HTML document. I'm going to get an element by its ID, which is this paragraph right here in this case. And then what we are going to do from there is actually take the style, which is like a keyword for CSS within HTML. You're actually going to get the style of that and then get the color. The color is, if you remember what it's called in CSS, it's the property, and then you're going to assign it a value. So let's see. Oh, yeah. Okay. So let me, oh, I thought this was a visual. Okay, let me try just in case. Oops. Let's see if this, okay, never mind. I thought it gave a visual, but I don't know if it'll work in here, but let's try. Okay. So instead of button, let me just change all of this real quick. Let's do Okay, I'm gonna comment out all of this. If you guys remember, an asterisk plus a slash is how you do multi-line comments. And this will be good to show you guys how to do this as well. So a div, I'm gonna, oh, let's not do that. Let's just call it div. So I've already accessed my div in the HTML using JavaScript. Now I'm gonna take that element and I'm gonna add an event listener. So add event listener. And in this case, I'm gonna, okay, the other way to do this is, if you remember down here when we said add event listener click, we could have said on click as well. So on load, okay. And let's do this, or actually, let me just be consistent with this. Listener, let's actually, let me change this to a button. This will be much easier to see. Sorry, guys. So let's keep that name there. And then let's actually add a button in here. Button. Okay. So now I'm going to go back into the JavaScript. I've accessed my button within JavaScript. Now I'm going to add an event listener. When I click on the button, I want it to execute like some sort of code. As you remember down here, we declared a function. So we're going to do here, here. So everything within here is what I'm actually going to do. And now I'm going to take my styles and I'm going to change the color of it to, let's just change it to green. Okay, now let's run this. So as you can see, I have a new button here. When I click on it, why is it not turning green? Let's see. Click. Oh, maybe not the quotes. It's now color green. Is that it? Okay. Well, let's make this more obvious then. So I'm going to have a div. I'm going to access two elements here, actually. So if you remember the div, I called it with an ID my div. So now I'm actually going to change the div's color. So let's do that. Oops, div. This should work. So if you remember, this div right here is currently blue. Now I'm going to change it to green. What the? That is quite weird. Perhaps Replit doesn't support multi-line. See if that's the issue. No, it should. Okay, what you guys should be seeing is this div turning green. There's some Replit syntax thing that I'm not figuring out right now. And we don't have the time today to do that. But basically, just remember that you can change the CSS using JavaScript as well. You access it through the HTML document. So take the HTML, then access the actual styles, the CSS, from there access the properties, and then assign it the value just the way you would within CSS. Okay. Whew. That was a short lecture. I promised that was going to be short. Apparently, it's not. Okay, so before we do a Kahoot, let's take 15-ish minutes for you guys to actually practice. So if you guys don't have your own development environments, feel free to use the Replit, the link I've shared in the chat. Feel free to delete anything that I've written here and rewrite your own. But the challenge I want us to be working on is to recreate something. So let's go to images. This is a really common it's like practice or like okay, they changed the logo. I forgot. Okay, subscribe button. Let's recreate the YouTube subscribe button. And okay, which one should we go with? Let's go with this one. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so since we have limited time, what I want you guys to do is try recreating this logo subscribe button without the YouTube, like the video play button over here, because that would require like images and more elements. It'll take more time. So just try to create the red box with the subscribe words within it. And a few key details to notice. So first of all, the text has to be white, the background has to be red. The other thing I want you guys to do is make sure that there's experiment with the units in there, the pixels, the inches, the centimeters, whatever the units are in there, experiment with those and make sure that you have some margins on the sides and the top and the bottom. And then the last thing as a challenge, I never explicitly taught this. These are just like CSS things that you guys can search up on your own. It'll be good practice for you guys to see how you actually access methods and CSS that you guys don't know. Try to create the rounded borders. And as a hint, that's going to be in CSS, not the HTML. So try looking up what sort of CSS is going to let you create rounded borders. And then look at what the units are for that when you're assigning the values, what the properties are. And yeah, so let's take 15 minutes to just recreate the button. Okay. If you guys have questions, let me know, or Joseph, and yeah. Oh, okay. Hi, Brian. I noticed you just joined. Basically, what we already went over is just talking about how to, like, re-emphasizing how to access the JavaScript and CSS within the HTML file, and then how to access the HTML on the reverse side from the JavaScript and CSS as well. But that's mostly all in the lectures. What we're doing right now is recreating. Let me share my screen quickly again. We're just trying to recreate a simple subscribe button that you would see on YouTube. So for now, try to ignore the video like play button over here. Just try to create like a red background with white text with the words subscribe. And then so two more things to note. Make sure experiment with the units. The top and the bottom should have some margins, slightly less on the sides. And then lastly, as a challenge, see if you can create the rounded border here. We never explicitly talked about how to do that, but Google it, ChatGPT it, W3 Schools it, do whatever you want, experiment with it, see what you guys can learn. And if you guys have questions, feel free to speak up or type in the chat. So 15 minutes, let's reconvene at 5:48. Okay, guys. So instead of doing a Kahoot, which I don't think we have time for, I'm just gonna share my screen and then show you guys the um, code that I have and just really quickly go over like what it all means. Okay, so really quickly, let me copy and paste. And don't worry if you guys didn't get it. This was actually the first project that I tried when I started doing web development, and it took me a while, and I watched a tutorial. So, okay. I also added some extra JS for you guys to look at in case you guys were interested, but I'll just walk you guys through the basics. In case you're not in the Replit, let me share my screen again. Here, basically, okay. So let me run this first so you guys can see. This is why is so weird. Oh, I did this. Okay. So this is a little different, but I wanted to show you guys like how you could have the background actually change as well. It's really easy to make it just like the solid background, but basically, so in the HTML, it's really simple. You're gonna have your head and all of that. And notice how we included the CSS in the head. And as a like a good practice, putting the script, the JavaScript at the bottom of the body. Our body is really just one thing. It's just one button. And I included an ID attribute so that I'm able to access it within the JavaScript without accessing all button elements, should I decide in the future to add more. So this way I'm singling out just this one. Okay, so now that I have that, I'm going to go into my styles first and show you guys. So the body, everything here is just like really typical for a body element, like a demonstration. It does nothing to the button. It's just like I'm having it centered in the center of my screen, top and bottom, left and right. The height is like my body is entire, like the entire height of the screen, so vertically, and then I don't want margins. So the really key part is the actual button. So the button here, you can ignore the padding for now. That's just more box layout things. You really can't. It's not necessary unless you have like a lot of crowded elements in your HTML. Sorry. Okay, so I specified a font size to go with like my actual button text. So my button is 18 pixels. The text is 18 pixels, sorry. And then the border I created, so this is like a way to specify multiple things in one line. You can, so just ignore the solid part for now. So my border is going to be 2 pixels. As you can see, that's about how wide 2 pixels is. I'm also specifying that the border is going to be solid. So you can specify all of these things on separate lines. So border, right? I can also specify the color on different lines as well. It's just a different property name. I can call it border slash border hyphen color. It's just this way I only have to specify border once and it's easy to read. So my width is going to be 2 pixels. I'm going to have it be solid. I don't want it like translucent or like flashing or whatever. And then I'm going to give it like the classic red color. So a lot of these things you can really ignore. But the key part, this is the thing, the challenge that I gave you guys. The border radius is actually what changes the rounded corners. So just to show you guys, if I change this radius to right now it's 8, right? If I change it to 18, notice what happens when I reload the page. It became a lot more rounder, so a lot rounder. So the larger your border radius is, the more rounded it's going to be. So that was just one attribute that you guys could have searched up and played around with. The background color here is white because, as you'll see in a moment, I want to show you guys the interactivity, but you could just easily make this red and satisfy the requirements I was talking about. And because I made the background white to show you guys the interactivity, I also made the text I made the text black, which is the default, so you won't see it here. But if you guys wanted to, you would just have the text color. Oops, what is this? You would just have the color be white, right? But you'll see in a moment the functionalities that I added. So, and then this thing, this is another extra thing that I added. I didn't expect you guys to do this, but basically, if you'll notice, so right now I have my typical mouse. If I hover over the button, it turns into a hand. And this might be something that you've noticed as you've gone through various websites. It's really simple, actually. So it's just one line in the CSS. It's talking about the cursor here. Oops. So the cursor, just your mouse, it's going to specify when you actually hover over this button, what is your cursor going to look like? And the hand, in this case, is called a pointer. And you can experiment with other things there, but I won't today because we're running out of time. But okay. And then this transition thing, you can really ignore. If you noticed, there's like, it just appeared and then it just disappeared and appeared because it's like only 2 seconds. So if let's change the color of this. If I made it like a full second, then see, it took a while longer to load. Or 10 seconds, let's see. Oops. I see what okay. Yeah, okay, just ignore this for now. It was the wrong property I remembered. But basically, one more thing here, the CSS, this is another cool thing that you guys can search up and add. You might wonder, when I hover over this, see, this is the interactivity I was talking about. It changes color. So this is actually something that's not in JavaScript, but like it's more of a style. So, okay. Why is it still? Oh, it's still running. I see. Okay. Replit is so weird sometimes. Okay. If you guys pay close attention to this text right here, it's actually flashing. See, from gray to black. If you pay really close attention, it's oscillating back and forth. So the reason for that is this transition thing. That's why it's still running. Okay. That's so weird. So basically what you're seeing right now, like, is the previous file that I ran, it's still running. It didn't automatically stop because I didn't specify it anywhere. So this transition is just the text flashing back and forth. You really don't have to worry about it. But basically, what I want to talk about here is the CSS. I just added this hover thing. This hover is something like inherent in CSS, but there's a lot of complicated things that you can add by downloading other things, importing it to the CSS. But the hover is just a basic thing. It's just saying when you hover over the button, then what do you do? So when I hover over it, notice that cursor isn't actually in the hover section because cursor by definition is only rendered when you're hovering over it. But I can externally specify yet another button thing that's specifying when it's hovering. And when I do hover, it's going to turn red and it's going to turn, okay, white, but because of the transition thing I did earlier, it's not doing that. But last of all, last but not least, I want to show you, this is something that I added in here just for fun. So JavaScript, just to show you guys again, I'm calling this my subscribe button. In my document, I'm getting it by the ID. Remember, I called it the subscribe button with my ID. So now taking this JavaScript variable, which encompasses all the information that was in the HTML, I'm going to add an event listener. I'm going to add click. And don't worry, this is just like a simplified way to write functions. Functions, you can typically tell because they're in brackets, curly brackets. So what I'm going to do here is, as you can see, I'm actually specifying, let's see here. Yep. So when I click this, you can see it actually turned into subscribed. And it's like solid now. It's no longer, what do you call it, white. So let's just analyze this really quickly. So the first thing I did, I'm actually changing the text content. So notice I'm taking the HTML, and as I'm accessing the styles, I'm accessing the text content. So yeah, I'm accessing the text content, which is like the property in there. And then I'm assigning it a value of subscribed. So instead of telling me to subscribe, I'm already subscribed. And then, okay, this is the part that I figured out we messed up on earlier. So when you're trying to access like colors, especially if you're using like the hexadecimal system, like the hex codes, make sure you have the pound key. I forgot about that. So that was why it wasn't rendering. But basically, you're still going to go into the HTML element. You're going to access the styles. You're going to take the property, which first of all, I want to do background color. So I'm changing it to this. This is just red, like after you do a bit of web development, these basic colors you're going to have memorized like a nerd like me. But basically, this is red, so I'm assigning it to the background color now. And notice, even though I haven't changed my actual CSS in here, my background color is still white for the button. My JavaScript in the HTML, I loaded it at the very end. So it's going to be constantly updating. It's going to be reflecting what I'm doing in the website and what's being changed in the background. This is what's really nice about it. And remember, we loaded the CSS at the very top in the head. So the CSS is just there. Afterwards, I've taken my JavaScript, the interactive parts, and within that, later on, so when your code is actually executing, the time, the order in which you're doing it actually matters. What you have in the HTML is read all at once, but afterwards, everything you click on, all of that, that's still in chronological order. So because it's in chronological order, and I've assigned the background color red, again, later on in my JavaScript, when I clicked on it, this now overrides the previous one. And that's why this is still here as opposed to the white. And then finally, the same thing here, style.color. Remember, .color as a default is just text color. It's just talking about the text. So all Fs here is just specifying white. So as you can see, let's go back here. Let me run that again. So see, our CSS has been loaded in here. It's been rendered. The background is white. My text is black. It's oscillating. When I go back to my script over here, however, you can see that if I click on it right now, it's going to override these things. So when I click, notice it came later in the HTML. It's in the body at the very end. And now it stays like that. It's not being, it overrid what was previously there. Whew. Okay, good timing on this. So hopefully you guys found that interesting. Again, don't worry, like all of the extra things I added, the interactivity, the oscillating, I just wanted to show you guys like the cool things that you guys could do. I know we've been doing a lot of lectures these past few weeks and it's boring, frankly. But hopefully that that showed you guys when you put things together, how cool it can get. Okay, that's it for class today. Next week, we'll talk about some more complex topics, HTTP, APIs, just bootstrap, some things that you might want to know, but we're not really going to do hands-on with them. It's just interesting lecture, I would say. So yeah, thanks for coming and see you guys in the next class.